Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next webinar. I'm so excited you joined us today. My name is Clara. I'll be hosting today's conversation. And yeah, we have more folks joining in as I'm speaking. Please let us know in the chat where you're joining us today. We have chat where you can communicate with other attendees as well. I am currently joining from Prague, Czech Republic. We have a beautiful sunny afternoon, so I'm hoping that will send more positive vibes and sunshine to everyone who joins us today. We have the amazing Amanda Qualls joining us. And before I invite her to stage, I'll quickly give you a few groundkeeping information before we kick things off. All right. Amazing. So today's conversation will be a panel talk. So I have a lot of questions for Amanda about hybrid and remote onboarding and how to work best with the remote teams and design programs that are scalable. And our conversation is definitely open to discussion. So whether you have any comments or ideas or any of your own experiences with remote or hybrid onboarding, please feel free to share them in the chat. I'm sure that all of our attendees will really appreciate it. And we also have a questions box that you can use to post your questions that you have for our host, Amanda, today. You can also upvote questions from all of our other attendees, so you can see all the questions that are lining up. We'll be pulling the questions during the conversation, but we also have some time in the end that we'll set aside where we'll go through all of the questions that you have posted. And of course, today's conversation is recorded, and everyone who is attending us or joining us today will get the recording in their inbox. And, in case you just have to run early or something comes up, we got you covered. So I'll make sure to send that to everyone after we're finished today. Amazing. And today's webinar is hosted by Gather. I am the head of community and people at Gather, and what we do is we're building project management software designed specially for people operations. We are working with teams from sizes of 20 to 500 and even 800 folks. So in case you're looking to automate your people ops processes, please feel free to reach out. And we recently launched a people community for all of our amazing people ops folks that have been around Gather for the last few months and years. So I'll make sure to send a link here as well, so you can join us in the community. All right, amazing. Enough from me. I would love to invite Amanda to the stage today, and we'll do a quick round of introductions. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I am doing very well today. And hello to everyone who's joining us. I'm seeing all of the locations. That's great.
Amazing. So happy to have you here. Could you give us a little introduction about yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So my name is Amanda Qualls, and I've been working in the human resources and people operations space for more than a decade. I came to people operations really organically. I got my first taste of this kind of work as a teenager when my mom was a business owner. And I got to help out on a variety of fronts and was exposed to sort of HR at that point. When I went off to college, I studied art history, and then I pursued a master's in library science. So not people operations, but in my work experience, I kept leaning into HR. So I worked for my university's career center for several years, then in a library management role, and I took my first full-time HR job in 2013 as Ballotpedia's director of training. And since then, I've worked in a variety of HR roles, from director of HR, head of an operations department, and I now work as a human resources consultant and contractor. I should also mention that more than 6 years of my experience was in a fully remote environment, or has been in a fully remote environment. So a lot of experience under my belt there. And I will say that I live in Goshen, Indiana, which is a lovely little Midwestern town, about 90 minutes from Chicago, 15 minutes from Michigan, Eastern time zone. And I have the pleasure of working from home with my 2 dogs and 2 cats, which I hope don't interrupt this process.
Amazing, amazing. I'm sure we'll all actually love to have a few visitors, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Great, and thank you so much for the lovely introduction. And yeah, I'm really sure we'll see. We'll hear about more of your experiences throughout the webinar as well. Yeah, and we're so happy to have you here. Yeah, so today we'll talk about onboarding, and I myself am a firm believer that onboarding is, one of the most important experiences in the overall employee journey. And in the last few months, we may say year and a half, things have taken a different turn, and most teams have turned either into remote teams or now are going back as hybrid teams. So we'll talk about what that means today with Amanda. As I mentioned, I have a lot of questions for her. I'll be kind of sharing the questions on the slides as well, so you can follow today. And we'll kick things off with kind of understanding what is the current state of onboarding in general, right? Before I ask my first question, I think it would be great to kind of define what we understand by hybrid, remote, and distributed teams, because I feel like there has been a lot of these different buzzwords around where and how teams are located. So for the purpose of the conversation, I thought we could kind of quickly summarize these. So in terms of remote teams, right, we understand a team that's working completely online. Everyone's in different locations, oftentimes even different time zones. For hybrid teams, you can actually have a team that's all in one city, everyone has one office, and the employer gives the opportunity to their teams to choose whether they want to come in the office or no, or travel, or kind of have partially remote work. And when we talk about distributed teams, that's when we have teams in multiple locations, either in multiple offices or in hybrid offices. So there is a combination between these three. So I'm hoping we'll have a chance to kind of cover all of them. But I think the one thing that unites all of these different situations is that these situations make it much more harder to create a seamless onboarding experience, right? So today we'll talk about how to build the bridge to create an amazing onboarding experience. All right, let's get to it. Amanda, let's talk about the current state of onboarding, right? How has onboarding been so far in the last few months in these crazy times? And my first question is, why do you think companies still have trouble, running their onboarding processes smoothly?
So I think it's really a mix of oversight and burnout. I think it's become over the past, many years obvious to employers why you have to invest in hiring processes, right? If you don't spend the time and attention developing your employer brand, building your candidate pipeline, creating a strong application review and interview process, you're not going to get the right people in the door. And the bottom line is that messing up the hiring process is really going to cost you a lot of money. And that's become very clear to employers. Similarly, if you don't invest time in training and developing your employees once you have them in the door, then you're leaving money on the table. It's fairly obvious why you should develop your folks once you have them, to make sure that you're getting all that you can out of your employees and you're helping them grow and develop, however that might look in your organization. But new employees, this onboarding period is this weird liminal space. So you hopefully have invested in your hiring processes and got the right person for the job, and you hopefully have processes to help them develop down the road. But new employees require something totally different, right? You have to, as you just said, build that bridge between candidate and now high-performing employees. So once you hire someone, they don't just become your employee right away. You have to bridge the gap between candidate and high-performing employee. And the gap doesn't close on day one. So many companies are still getting onboarding wrong because they're coming at it from the wrong mindset. Onboarding a one-day thing, or even a one-week thing. It is a many-step process that starts from the moment someone accepts their offer until hopefully months down the road, and you have these processes to support them along the way.
So would you say the mindset and kind of understanding what shape it is kind of the first step, right, to take when figuring out what the onboarding process should look like then?
Yeah, it's really like thinking about this period as almost like a third type of person, right? It's like you have a candidate and then you have your employee, but then the onboarding period is just something totally different. So thinking through that and then what that person needs is really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Amazing. Now that we've covered kind of, what's the current state, what would you say is kind of the biggest challenge for teams in terms of remote or hybrid onboarding?
So the biggest challenge that I've seen is onboarding that involves multiple locations. So the sort of hybrid and distributed team is, I think, the most challenging way to onboard. So when you're fully remote, you can find workarounds and build systems that will be fairly repeatable, even if people are in totally different locations all across the world. But if you have, multiple offices or multiple offices and remote workers, it can get really messy, right? So you need really tight communication in that situation between members of the onboarding team to know who does what, when, where that person needs to be. And that understanding needs to be internal and it needs to be new employee facing. So the new employee has to have everything they need. And then internally, you need to have everything you need. So it's always the case during onboarding, in my opinion, that more is more. So people get nervous ahead of starting a new job, anticipating all of the questions people might ask, providing them with answers and resources ahead of time. Very important. Hybrid, distributed, even more important. You have to be crystal clear about when and where things are happening.
Absolutely. And I love your quote, more is more. And I absolutely agree because I think you can never have too much information during onboarding. And even if you share a thing, once or twice or even 3 times, there is so much that onboardees have to learn during their first weeks that the more you repeat, right, the more likely they're going to remember. The more team members they meet, the more they'll be integrated, right? Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you that you cannot go wrong with with kind of over informing in at least the first few weeks. So let's talk about some of the onboarding essentials that you feel like every company should have. And I know you've worked with many teams now, especially running your business and consulting for many companies. So I'm quite interested to understand, what do you understand is like the main pillars for remote or distributed or hybrid onboarding? What are the building blocks that you believe every company should have?
Yeah, so I think in general that the pillars of onboarding and like the components of onboarding are the same, but you should think through your onboarding process and what your organization needs, because you might need to invest more in a particular area or something than other teams, right? Depending on, are you in person? Are you hybrid? Are you remote? Are you distributed? What is the case? So the first thing that I would say is what we just talked about, more is more. Over communicate. I think that is a pillar of onboarding. You have to over communicate. So you might think that one email a week before someone starts is enough to cover the pre-boarding period, but it's likely not. Think about all of the things that you would want someone to know before they start. What technology are you going to use? What expectations do you have for the new employee? What is the schedule for the first week? If they're coming to a physical location at all, where do they park? What do people wear, right? These are things that people worry about before their first day. Are they going to be underdressed or overdressed? Anticipate those sorts of things and provide information and guidance. Make a plan for communicating all of that information. For both the pre-boarding stage and the onboarding stage, it's a good idea to have hubs for your information. So you don't want new hires sifting through their email looking for a very specific thing that you told them. If you can deliver information via email and then link to resources that are persistent, then that will ensure that people can find the information that they need easily. And if they can't find the information that they need easily, you'll know where to direct them. So over communicate, make sure that there are places to point people. Don't bury information just in one message that you have to sort of direct people back to. So the next thing I would say is that you should mind your medium. So this is true whether you are onboarding in person, in a remote team, hybrid team, and or distributed. But this point becomes especially important in hybrid situations where time zones might become more of a barrier to communication. So what information or relationship building needs to happen in a meeting? What can be recorded and provided to the employee? What can simply be an email? In general, live training is great because you aren't just teaching, you're developing a relationship and a rapport with the new employee. You're getting to know them a little bit, but sometimes there are rote trainings that are okay to be delivered via recording. So if there are certain sessions you do every single onboarding, like an introduction to Asana or Slack, it can be really handy to have those recorded because someone might want a refresher down the road. So even if you choose to do it as a live training, you might want to then provide a recording like this later. With that said, you might see my cat who is now jumped directly next to my computer. So I often tell new employees too that we know that starting a new job is like drinking from a fire hose. We're going to give you all of this information in the first couple of weeks. We don't expect you to retain it all. And if you need a refresher or support, here are the resources that we have. The last thing about minding your medium that I want to mention, because I think it's really important and often gets overlooked, is that different people learn differently, right? Some of us learn in this way. Some of us learn by reading. Some of us learn by doing. So if you can think through your onboarding and make sure that you're supporting all of those different learning styles, like you might do a one-on-one training like this, and during it, you demo what you're talking about. And then you also provide the person with written documentation of the call or the Asana or Slack guide or something like that. That can really be just incredibly game-changing to an employee. And it's also inclusive because everybody is different. Maybe you have an employee who has a visual impairment or a hearing impairment. And if you're thinking through those things ahead of time, you're just going to help the most people in the best possible way. So I have one more pillar. So my first two pillars are over-communicate and mind your medium. And then lastly is make a plan for how to convey your culture. And this is what I think is really important for remote teams. So like all of these pillars, it's important in every situation, but this takes on added importance in the remote space. So in person, you can count on the fact that your new employee will be able to easily observe the behaviors of their colleagues. Do people congregate for coffee at lunchtime? Do people step out at the same time to have their midday meal together? Is the vibe of the office really prompt and professional, or is it not? There are many cues that we experience in social situations in person that we can't intuit in the same way in a remote space. Those behaviors become obscured behind technology. So you need to think about how people will interact with your culture and then think about conveying that. So think about what your culture is, make a plan to convey your culture. This has 3 benefits. You're going to spend time thinking about your culture, and maybe there are some things you would like to change. This is a good time to really think through that. You're going to help get your new hire up to speed more quickly, ensuring a smooth transition for them. And then finally, you're going to preserve and propagate your culture so that you don't have unintentional drift. This last piece is really important if you experience periods of big expansion. Let's say you're a team of 40 and now you're going to become a team of 50. Well, you have changed over like 25% of your workforce. You've grown. So you need to have a way to preserve and propagate your culture. And then make sure you're documenting all of this, right? No matter what you're doing, document. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with you that documentation is key. So could you quickly recap the 3 pillars that you have shared with us?
Yes. The first one is over-communicate. The second is mind your medium. And then finally, make a plan for how to convey your culture and build that into your process.
Amazing. I absolutely agree with you. And when talking about kind of building, if we have these pillars in mind and we're building our onboarding process or rebuilding our current onboarding process into more of a hybrid or remote friendly environment, what are some of the key steps in the process itself that you think companies should not skip? You mentioned maybe some pre-boarding communication or onboarding training. What are some of the crucial steps that you think every employee should understand when they join a new team?
Yeah, so you picked up my first point, which is don't skip pre-boarding. The time before a new employee officially starts in their job with you is precious and it's vital. So your new employee may have accepted your job offer, but they're still figuring out what they think of you, right, as an employer. So don't give them a bad impression by ghosting them before their first day. Have a series of planned messages that can go out. Let them know what to expect, who they can come to with questions ahead of time. And as day one gets closer, what exactly onboarding is going to look like during their first weeks and months. You should not fail to define expectations for day one, week one, month one. People want to know what is expected of them. Employees are eager to start contributing and to make a difference and to not feel like, oh, it's taking me so long to get up to speed. Let them know what you're expecting and when. You might say, your first week, you're going to meet with the people team. You'll have some training with your manager to start to learn your specific job. You're going to have one-on-ones with your team member, but you won't actually start doing any of the things that you would do in your job until week 2. And we expect that you won't be fully up to speed in your role until the end of month 1. So you sort of lay it out for them so they know sort of what the time scale is. It helps ratchet down stress. It lets your employee know that you've thought about their experience, which is a really good feeling. And you know how they're going to grow and how you're going to support them. And that's a really good impression.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump in, but it's almost defining what you're not expecting of them as well, right? You're not expecting them to be on Slack at 9 p.m. on their first week, right? You're not expecting them to know everything on the first week. I think that can be really stressful, especially if you're, as you mentioned, not with your peers in one office and you don't feel the energy. It's really hard to understand what's actually expected of you. So I'm really, really grateful that you mentioned expectations kind of as one of the first points, because I agree that it's vital to their experience.
Yeah, and alongside those expectations, like the culture piece blends in, right? Because hopefully in your 1 or 2 days, you're going to be saying something like, you might receive Slack messages outside of your working hours. The expectation is that you don't need to reply to those until you are back, in the office, whenever that is for you, right? So yes, absolutely defining expectations, talking about the culture, all of that is really important. And then the last thing that companies should not skip is have a process for collecting information about your onboarding program. You should collect information about the new employee themselves. So how are they doing? Did you notice any red flags or really green flags during the onboarding process? Any needs that the people team can help support? And then collect information about the onboarding program itself. Is there somewhere that new employees are getting hung up? Are there lots of questions after you train new people in a particular system? Onboarding is not a static thing. It's something that you create and then you collect information and you iterate, right? It's dynamic. So don't be precious about your process. Plan to change it because it will definitely need to change.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you mentioned the pillars, right? You mentioned the steps that we need to take. I think it would be great to define who should be actually involved in implementing and running the onboarding process, right? Is it just the people team, or is anyone else in the team kind of a part of it, right? When talking about the first days and first weeks of the new hire life cycle.
Yeah, so I think this really depends on the size of your organization and how specialized roles are. If you have people folks who are full-time people folks, then I strongly recommend that they drive the process for developing, implementing, and running the onboarding program, just as they would for hiring or offboarding separations. But driving the process doesn't mean the people team does everything. Ideally, onboarding is going to be a collaboration between people operations folks who can drive standardized messaging and training that every new person needs, and the hiring manager or the department head, team members of the new employee, executives. Everybody has a part that they can play to really give that new employee a complete view. And it also just helps engage your managers, right? They shouldn't think like, oh, at the end of week 2, I'm going to get this person and they're going to be fully ready to go. Like they have a part to play for sure. So you should involve everyone. It's great the more people that can participate. It's ideal if the new employee has a clean experience, which is why I recommend like the people operations team really owns the process, because they can sort of make sure it's standardized and clear. But you want to involve as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Let's move on to some of the best practices that you have implemented and also that you have seen when it comes to onboarding. I have actually kind of a question directed more to you. What is your workflow when you are kind of implementing or even designing an onboarding process, right? When you have a new company or you have a new team that needs your help designing their remote onboarding experience, what are kind of the steps that you take to build it out, to understand what needs to happen?
Yeah, I'm actually in the midst of this right now with one of my clients, which is really exciting. So I will preface this by saying this is my preference, but everybody works in different ways, and I think that's totally fine. We will all get there in the end. So the first thing that I like to do is to see what exists. So if you're coming into an organization that has ever brought on another employee other than you, some sort of onboarding process has taken place. Even if it was really bare bones. So I like to dive into what has been done. I like to review documents, templated messages, any sort of checklist, things like that first. And then once I have those documents and I've spent some time sort of sifting through them, thinking about them, maybe providing some feedback, then I like to meet with other members of the team to talk to them about what successes they've had and what issues they've experienced with onboarding so far. So once I have the documents and then I do the interviews, then I can build a skeleton of a new or revamped program. And then you run the program, right? You can tweak forever to try to make it perfect, but the best way to figure out what gaps still exist or what's working really well is to run it. So collect the documentation, meet with people, build or rebuild something, and then go through the process. As I mentioned earlier, you want to collect feedback. So you should get that from new hires, managers, anyone else who is interacting with the system, so that you can make changes as needed. Some people like to have a process that's like pretty clean before they run it. that's totally valid. If you want to get like 90% of the way there before you put your first hire through it, totally fine. If you want to get like 60% of the way there, run a hire through it, then change it again. Maybe you get 90% of the way that time. It's totally fine, whatever works for you, as long as you're hitting the major points, right? There are, I will also say, if you are the first hire in your organization or basically onboarding does not exist, there are lots of resources out there to help you. So Gather has some great resources around onboarding. So after this webinar, I will make a LinkedIn post and link to some of these resources so you can see them. But I will be linking the Gather one there because there's some great ideas for you. If you're a member of SHRM here in the US, which is the Society of Human Resource Management, they have a ton of resources, including a new employee onboarding guide, understanding employee onboarding toolkit, and more. Many resources out there to help you if you're tackling this for the first time. And it's helpful to tap people in the community. So we're having this conversation here. There are lots of people over in the chat. Reach out to one another to get ideas, because we might all do things a little bit differently, but it can help you sort of think through your process.
Absolutely. And I've shared your link to your LinkedIn in the chat for everyone so they can connect and follow your post as well. Amazing. You mentioned that kind of on the beginning, to that one of the pillars is to mind your medium and to actually document everything. And I love documenting. I love building our processes and kind of walking people through everything step by step and making sure that documents are helpful and also fun. How to best document the onboarding process. What has been your best practice, or what has been sort of the working the best you've seen so far?
Yeah, so I would hesitate to say that there is a best way to onboard, because it really depends on what's in use in your organization. And what is in use is really important. Even if maybe it's what's in use is not the best tool, if your organization is using it, then it's the best tool, because that's the one where people can access the information. So in the organizations where I've worked, we have relied really heavily on Google Docs, Sheets, Slides, as well as Asana. So within Google Apps, we can build manuals, timetables that are both operations facing for people who are doing the onboarding, and new employee facing, such as like welcome guides, one-pagers, quick references. Some other docs that we tend to include are how to work with me documents, which I think are really cool. Intro to Slack. So not just, hey, this is how Slack operates. Most people know that, but more like what channels exist, who says what, where, that sort of thing. And company glossaries, which I think should be in use more places. So like specialty info or terminology that people might encounter. So within task management software, such as Monday, Asana, things like that, anything you might be using, you can build templated checklists, both, again, for yourself and for the new hire. As long as those are being used within your organization and people are actually checking them, and that's where they're doing their work, it's a great way to communicate and to cut down on chatter. There are lots of tools out there. Gather is building out really cool people operations tools, right? So it's what works best for you and your team, and committing to it. It has to be accessible and it has to be used and maintained. That's what documentation is all about.
Yeah, and I loved what you mentioned about what's the best tool, the one that you're currently using. I think I've seen a lot of people ops folks putting really high benchmarks and trying to launch these perfect onboarding processes that take months to design. But during those months when you're designing, you have new hires coming through and being onboarding without any support tools, right? So what you mentioned, maybe try off to start with 60%, collect feedback and iterate and improve and so on and so forward. I think that's really important because, even one tool is better than no tool. And I think starting with mapping out the basics, like kind of the glossary or explaining how Slack works. If your company is maybe more than 10 people, it can already become a bit overwhelming to understand what's happening. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. I've actually seen a few resources where or a few pages where companies have shared their internal handbooks kind of for inspiration. So I might share that with our attendees after the webinar. I'll see if I can find this library of company handbooks where you can kind of get inspired around how other companies have built their internal documentation. Amazing. And I have my final question for you before we go to our Q&A. And that is, do you have any favorite cherry on top to make the onboarding process truly memorable for the new hires? Is there something special, something really fun that you love to implement in the onboarding process when you design it?
So I think that the best onboarding programs are true reflections of your company's culture. Every organization is unique. Some cultures, as I've mentioned, are more professional and rigid. Others are looser and more casual. In some workplaces, the tone is very academic. Think like old guard news organizations like Washington Post, things like that. While in others, it might be more playful. Think about the Motley Fool, if you're familiar with them as an organization at all. If not, you should go check them out. They have some interesting people operations stuff out there. So when you think about what a cherry on top is for you and your organization, it should be something that feels in alignment with that culture and reinforces that culture. So maybe you send your new employee meals during the first week, or a package arrives with company swag on day one, or maybe you just have a really heartfelt session on your organizational values. The cherry on top does not have to be a physical thing, but you'll know when you found it because new hires will give feedback on it. At Pete for America, so I was human resources director for Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign, and I worked with my deputy director of human resources to build out onboarding, and then he deployed this like beautiful program for bringing on so many employees so quickly. So we went from when he and I joined, we were like 200 employees to 550 employees in the space of just a few months, and he built a beautiful session on rules of the road, the rules of the road for the campaign. And he walked employees through all of the rules of the road and really what they meant. And then he talked about, one of the rules of the road and what it meant to him, and really, seizing on that feeling of like why he was there. Because campaigns are notoriously challenging workplaces, right? The hours are long. You might be working outside in horrific weather. It's just like a really challenging workplace. And over the course of, when the campaign was winding down, or even when we were still on the trail, he would have people say to him how important that was to them, because they found like their purpose and their rule of the road. And on those days when they were knocking doors in sleet in the middle of rural Iowa, they were able to say like, this is why I'm here. So the cherry on top can be totally different depending on your organization, but like make sure that it's true to your organization.
Absolutely. That is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We have a few questions in the chat actually, so I'll tackle them one by one. And the first question we got here was from Molly, and Molly was asking, what are some of the strategies for creating engaging content for functional onboarding in a remote environment? What sort of content can you build, or documentation or videos, etc., to make sure that your new hires are not overwhelmed and still engaged during the process?
Yeah, I think we all probably know like bad materials when we look at them, but sometimes it's really hard to like figure out like what makes materials good, which again is why iteration is so important, and thinking through and taking feedback. I think I have found it to be effective to have a mix of material types. So you want to have things that are visually engaging. You want to have things that are brief, but it's also okay to have things that are longer. So I mentioned like the company glossary. That's basically a little dictionary, and it should be navigable. Ideally, you should be able to click or easily search for what you're looking for within that, but it doesn't have to be like the prettiest document ever, right? It's pretty utilitarian. It's very text-based. But when you're talking about the culture and giving people an idea of the culture, what visually represents your culture, and think about that and how it is best digested. So again, having that mix of, okay, here's a one pager on Slack that's like really nicely designed and slick. Here's a slide deck on our culture that is also, really beautiful, but it's maybe a little bit longer. And here's some more utilitarian documents. So have a nice mix, because if you only have one type, I think that can kind of be overwhelming in itself. Have a spread of what you're looking for. And the same goes for any videos you might do. It's okay to have like some utilitarian walkthroughs of your system, but then also have some things that are a little bit more fun, or maybe you put some more time and energy into designing and making look nice.
Absolutely. I've been really interested in slide.com recently. That's kind of an internal documentation tool for teams, kind of similar to maybe a Notion library, where you can add different types of content, from embedding external links to adding videos, but also documentation. You're kind of working it in like Google Sheets or Google Docs or Notion. And I found that to be really, really kind of interactive, because you can have the type of content you mentioned on one page in different versions and different variables. Amazing. The next question we have is from Kalim, and it is: what are your thoughts about managers scheduling their monthly one-on-ones with the recurring calendar invites during the pre-boarding session? So I think that this is kind of, I guess, before the new hire comes in and they agree on how they'll have their one-on-one, or maybe even having one-on-ones during the pre-boarding process.
Yeah, so I think this really depends on how it is presented to the new hire and how it is set up, right? So if I had a manager, multiple managers, let's say maybe this was like the culture in your organization, where during the pre-boarding phase, they just like sent a calendar invite for the rest of eternity with no information on like what that was or why they were doing it. I don't think that's a good experience for your candidate, for someone who's just starting. That said, if, in your pre-boarding communications, maybe that are coming from you, where the manager is CC'd, you sort of preface what will be happening. Like your manager is going to be scheduling a monthly one-on-one call with you. During your first month, it will come, at your onboarding period. This is the format that those calls will take, and you'll learn more about them as you meet with your manager during your first week. Then I think that can be fine. So is it happening sort of as an end around people operations, and just like almost a sort of zombie like experience, like, well, I have a new report, I'm going to get them on my schedule? Or is it intentional, and are you giving information? Because I think if you are, it can be okay, but you need to be careful about that.
Absolutely. Amazing. The next question we have is from Gap, and it says: how do you best design a good transition from company to kind of the functional and team onboarding, right? Between kind of what's for everyone and kind of what's for the team. What is the best approach to work with teams, the individual teams in the company, to actually build that?
Yeah, so this is something that at Ballotpedia specifically, like, really changed over the course of years. I built the first like official onboarding program there in 2013, and then that changed over time. That transitioned to Lauren Dixon, who worked with me in people operations. I think she's here over the course of years, and then she continued to iterate it. So it's been happening there for a long time. And I would say the initial onboarding program that I designed was didn't integrate much with the teams that they would move on to outside of that initial onboarding period. So what we initially identified was, okay, all new employees to Ballotpedia need to know this set of things. And we designed calls and materials and trainings around all of those things. And then we started realizing after we implemented that, like that the transition to the team was like pretty jarring and it didn't feel seamless. And so we started tweaking when and how they would integrate with their team. So, okay, they're going to have their first team meeting on Wednesday, so like their third day, and then they will start to like slowly ramp up there. We also work with some teams to like create trainings that they will give repetitively. So like we can sort of monitor those things, but they more own them. So I think that this is a big trial area. Like you need to figure out what that transition point is. But I think it's really good to, again, if you've built feedback systems, involve the managers in those discussions. So, maybe a month after a new person has come on, you meet with the manager of that team and get feedback that, oh, that was a rough transition, or, oh, I think it would have been better for us to give this information at this point. And then you can adjust moving forward. And you want to do that with all of your sort of departments and teams, and different systems will grow up over time. You'll have sort of the big standardized stuff and then the stuff that they sort of foster in their own teams.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we have a lot more questions coming in. So the next one we got here is from Tanya. And the question is, how do you scale your onboarding process, right? Or maybe even how to build it scalably so that you don't have to rebuild it every few months when your team grows?
Yeah. So I would really try to identify the things that need to happen every time. So I've mentioned that a few times here. So what processes need to happen every single time you bring someone on? They need to know this system. They need to know about this meeting. So build out that first as the core of your onboarding program, and build your processes, your documentation around all of that. Build your checklists so you don't have to sort of re-engineer or keep rethinking about things. And then you can sort of scale from there. As I mentioned at Pete for America, we went from like 200 people when I joined to more than 550 people. We had to think about how would our onboarding sessions look in an onboarding class that could be 30 people. So think about if your content is adaptable to the class size of your onboarding experience. Ideally, it's something that can work for a big group, but can also be scaled down to a one-on-one experience. You will find what works for you as you iterate that process over time. But if you are sort of building the core processes first, then you can sort of tweak as necessary instead of hopefully having to like redesign something that's totally different.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the next question we have here is actually quite nicely, and it's actually a follow-up to this one. In a hybrid setting, should everyone be onboarded remotely? So it's an equal experience for all, right? So you have some people in office, some people in remote. So, do you scale the one experience that's remote, or do you kind of have two different trajectories in terms of onboarding? What would be your recommendation?
Yeah, I think this is challenging. And I think that this is something that probably all people operations people are thinking about a lot over the course of the next months as people start to return to offices and there are many more hybrid workplaces. I think this is a question that many workplaces are going to be confronting. Like if remote is acceptable, but we also allow people to come into the office, then how do we do that? How do we build an onboarding that doesn't privilege one group over the other, builds rapport with everyone? I would say I would not default to saying, well, everyone is going to be remote on day one. If you have some people who are intending to work in the office regularly, I think it's okay to bring them in, and you build a schedule that can sort of accommodate the physical tour before you start the sort of total experience. And then hopefully you are building out technology that can be engaging to a group that is mixed, because you're going to have a group that is mixed. After that day one experience, some people are going to be in the office and some people are going to be at home. So you want to start building those muscles from the first day, that this is the team. We're all, participating here. This is, the way that we can have meetings and see faces of the people who are at home, be around the table with the people who are here. And this is how we all work together. So I think I would strive to build a program that wasn't like the same experience for everyone, but built like an equitable working environment that then translates to after the onboarding period. Because I can tell you, I've seen some organizations that have gone hybrid recently do some really bad stuff in terms of like cutting people out of conversations, not, having like equitable meeting experiences for the people who are working remotely. So like start to build that technology and build those muscles now so that people understand like that's your teammate and you're working together no matter where you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's really a lot about, firstly, you can kind of design this around the candidate experience, right? Asking them, do you want to be, do you want to have your first week in the office? Do you feel safe coming to the office, or would you like to have it remote? And they can actually help you decide, right? I always think that's like always my number one recommendation to whatever question I get from a people ops folk. I'm always, have you asked your team? Because they're the ones that know the best. And if you ask your new hires, kind of, this is how we would want to, to have our onboarding experience. And you can do that during the hiring process even. You can then anticipate what's going to happen. And as you mentioned, you need to have the process and the technology built around the remote experience, but such way that you can connect people that are in a meeting room as well as remotely. And then it's kind of up to their choice how they choose to show up, whether they show up virtually that day or whether they come in, right? There can be many approaches. There can be many reasons why they want to be remote. And if, if an organization makes the commitment to be hybrid and to have flexible remote days, then I think you kind of need to anticipate that when you're building the process. Yeah, amazing. One last question we have here. What are some of the best tools to help new remote employees to feel welcomed?
Gosh, I think we've already talked about like some of the tools that I've used. So rather than specific tools, I would just say like, I would go back to that over communication piece. I think that communication through whatever tool you send it is what makes people feel welcome and feel like they are part of an organization. Having a point of contact, having someone checking in on them, that really helps bridge that gap again from candidate to employee to a part of this organization. So, if you want to onboard people into Slack before their first day, because that's where a lot of communication happens and you want them to be a part of that conversation, that's a decision that you can make as an organization. I think that's actually a really important policy to figure out. When do people join Slack? How are we, connecting with people ahead of their start versus day one and going forward? So yeah, your toolbox is whatever tools you're using and communication to the person to make them feel welcome into your organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think communication, if you actually invest the time into over communicating and really truly talking to your new hires, they will feel that they're welcomed, right? They will feel that they're cared about. Amazing. Thank you, Amanda, so much for joining me today in this conversation. I think it was great to cover all of the pieces that we have covered, and I'm sure there is so much more that we could talk about. But I want to be mindful of everyone's time. It was great to hear and to understand some of your best practices and your experience working in remote teams for the last 6 years, being kind of a bit ahead of time and building these experiences a lot longer than most of us. So I'm really, really grateful that you shared all of that with us today. So thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will just put myself out there. If anyone has questions, connect to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer questions and help however I can.
Absolutely. I have shared the link to our LinkedIn profile here as well. And yeah, as mentioned on the beginning on our webinar, I would love to invite everyone to our People community, which now has over 600 members. We share a lot of different materials and information from different templates for onboarding or offboarding, to a weekly newsletter, to access to these webinars early on, so you don't miss your spot since they're capped, and roundtable discussions, one-on-one networking, and much more. So I just wanted to quickly share this with you, and the link to sign up is in the chat for everyone here. All right, that's it. That's all from us today. Amanda, thank you so much again for your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on our next webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, have a great day, everyone.